right. Welcome to Week 11 Forum and to the third and final unit of this course. This week we address one of the central institutions of American government, Congress, and the executive branch. It's where most Americans think of as politics occurs at the federal level. This week we'll be discussing the role of Congress in our system. And then in Week 12 we'll be covering the presidency. With Congress, the first thing we need to note is that there are two houses, right? So why did the framers create a bicameral legislature? What distinctive roles do the House and the Senate play in the legislative process? How are the requirements for serving different? Major rationale for a bicameral legislature was, major event was the idea of the Great Compromise, which was discussed back in Chapter 2. That ensured that the interests of the smaller states would be, met, would be served in the Senate, and the House would represent the narrower interests of the federal districts, but also the broader interests of the people as a whole. That's why the House is called the People's House. As you read this chapter, you should think about the role that representatives play in modern government. Congresspersons should represent all of the members of their district. And that poses an interesting question, or an interesting set of questions. Can a wealthy man represent the interests of poorer members of their district? For that matter, can a man represent a woman? Can a white man represent the interests of black constituents? Can or should a Democratic representative fairly represent the interests of their Republican constituents, and vice versa? These questions focus our attention on what representation really means and what it requires. Does a person have to have been poor in order to understand the needs of the poor? Many scholars view Edward Kennedy as, historically one of the most powerful advocates for the poor in the history of Congress. And no one thinks he spent a moment actually experiencing poverty. Perhaps the most important attribute of a congressperson needs is empathy, the ability to put oneself in another's shoes, and the capacity to recognize that public service, sometimes means doing the right thing and not the partisan thing. That's something that we lose a lot, gets dropped out. Another important question revolves around the kinds of people that are elected to the House and the Senate. There are, several common characteristics. White males tend to be overrepresented. Congress as a whole is older than the mean population they represent. On average, members of Congress are considerably wealthier than their average constituents, or the median constituent. And that tendency is markedly greater in the Senate, which is often described as a millionaire's club. A significant percentage of both House and Senate members have practiced law for reasons that, understanding the law can provide a person with an important foundation for drafting legislation. But the fact that members of Congress are generally successful people, means that they come from the upper strata of their communities. And as a result, they might not always be sensitive or aware of the needs of their more economically distressed constituents. I raised the issue of gerrymandering in the overview, and I think it's one of the most serious challenges confronting our politics. What are the negative consequences that result from extreme partisan gerrymandering, like we've seen on both sides? What kinds of reforms would you advocate to, improve the redistricting process? Feel free to conduct some independent reading on your own on this issue, or any issue for that matter, and bring what you find into the forum. I would also suggest a modest proposal in terms of trying to improve representation. In addition to redistricting reform for the House, ensuring that federal districts are drawn in a fair and impartial manner, how about a redrawing of the states? What I would suggest is, why can't we amend the Constitution to prohibit that any state exceed 15 million or be smaller than 6 million? And we can have exceptions for non-contiguous states like Alaska and Hawaii. Getting rid of the mega states like California and the micro states like Wyoming might lead to more effective, better representation. What do you think? Another issue addressed in the chapter is pork barrel politics, which is basically something that results from a phenomenon known as log rolling, where members of Congress will trade votes in exchange with other members for support on their pet projects, which usually include money earmarked for their states or for their districts. For example, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia was known as the king of pork and managed to bring an estimated $7.3 billion in federal funds back to his state, which is why so many buildings, roads, and schools were named after him. Look, it's a commonplace for Americans to complain about corruption and to condemn pork barrel politics and earmarks as a waste of taxpayer dollars and a source of corruption. But another way of looking at pork barrel politics is that it's sort of the price of politics in general. One person's pork barrel politics is another person's very important project that may mean a road that connects towns in a district that increases economic activity. Or it may mean a veterans center in a small town that lacked the resources for veterans. In other words, it's not a simple black or white issue. Okay, and it's also something that occurs in virtually every legislative session, or throughout the world. In every legislature, this is just a commonplace. If there are no transactions to be done, then in a lot of instances, the politics of the common good is what gets sacrificed. Another important part of congressional organization is the committee system, which provides insight into how Congress works on a day-to-day basis. Woodrow Wilson, the only political scientist to become president, once observed that Congress in session is Congress on exhibition, while Congress in its committee rooms is Congress at work. What are the different kinds of committees that enable Congress to efficiently produce legislation and perform its oversight responsibilities? What, in your view, are the most important committees, and why? The last issue I want to address regarding Congress is its lawmaking responsibilities. The first thing we should recognize is that most legislation that's proposed in any two-year legislative session is destined to fail. Legislation fails for a variety of reasons. Sometimes legislators propose legislation as a stunt to draw attention to an issue that puts them in a good light and is never intended to be acted upon. Sometimes the legislative process uncovers serious flaws in legislation that requires, that actually causes more problems than it solves and causes the drafters to go back to the drawing board. Sometimes the legislation is well-meaning but controversial. And sometimes legislation is simply defeated because it would work adversely for the very powerful and wealthy people. It's always important to recognize that the legislative process, when it's working effectively, is designed to produce sound laws for the common good. Unfortunately, that is an increasingly rare occurrence. So if you look at the 1940s and 50s, which was sort of the heyday of legislative process in America, Congress routinely passed in excess of 800 pieces of legislation. In the 1955 and 56 session, they passed over 1,000 pieces of legislation. Since the 1980s, Congress has simply been less effective. And in the 2011-12 session, Congress passed fewer than 200 pieces of legislation. This year's session has been similarly unproductive. Is that a problem? Former House Speaker John Boehner once argued that Congress shouldn't be judged effective by the laws it passed, but rather should be judged on the basis of the bad laws they reverse. Is that a sound standard? I throw that out as a possibility. Okay, there's a lot to talk about this week. Let's have a great discussion.